Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday, it's gardening time, and boy, are we global already this morning. A shout out to Jean-Pierre in Belgium. Grandpa Gordy is watching from Hanoi. We've got Francis Batiki in British Columbia. It's always nice when we've got Tony O'Neill from the Simplified Gardening channel joining us from Wales. Eli is in Scotland from another great channel, In the Garden with Eli and Kate. And as always, we've got Heidi and Jay, our wonderful moderators, representing the United States and Canada. How awesome. And of course, all the others that are checking in from all over the world. We're going to be talking seeds today, but not just saving seeds, actually using this time of year when many of us are thinking about seeds to begin our planning for next year. I do that virtually every day I'm in the garden. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next year. Well, at this time of year where it's beginning to fade for many of us, this is an ideal time to start your planning, and the seeds you have right now really are a great place to start when it comes to what your garden is going to look like next year. Shandy's Garden, hello to you in Ohio. Colorado Bird Nerd in Colorado, of course. Skippy Dugan in Illinois. Isabella is in New York City. Isn't this fantastic to have everybody here? Definitely want to give a shout out to In the Garden with Eli and Kate, because I just did a video this last week where I planted garlic in my containers, and they have a wonderful video that they just released on their channel about planting garlic in containers as well. So certainly great minds do think alike. I encourage that you watch that video, because while a lot of the information is the same, I think it's a really good example of how you can do the same thing, but you do it differently in different areas, because our gardens are all different. So I'm in Colorado, very dry, very harsh winters, and I talk about using mulch in my containers because I want to hold the moisture in. My humidity gets down to single digits during the winter, very dry. And so the mulch helps keep my containers from drying out quickly. They have the opposite problem in Scotland, and that's what Eli talks about in the video, why she does not use mulch in her containers, because the mulch holds the water in, and when they have so much rainfall and a higher humidity, it can actually lead to problems with things like garlic. So great example, I think, between my video and their video of doing the same, but it's not the same. And so your garden probably falls somewhere on that spectrum between very dry and very wet. And that's one of the nice things about gardening, is there's always someone out there who is closer to the way we do it, but also doing it close enough to the way we do it that we can learn even when they're halfway around the world. So yeah, check out the video. It's often. There's thank you to you as well. I enjoyed your video. And it's fun to see the differences that we all have. Tony says Eli and Late's channel is brilliant, folks. You should definitely check it out. And of course, I talk about Simplified Gardening and Tony's channel all the time. So, yeah, Kate's. I knew what you meant after I read it. I've said this many times before. I really enjoy watching a lot of the videos from the UK, because in the UK, gardening just seems to be a passion that, I won't say the whole country because I don't like to stereotype, but it's a countrywide phenomenon. People garden, and you have on their TV channels, I love the BBC is devoted to gardening. We don't have anything like that here in the United States. So the enthusiasm and some of the techniques and some of the ways of doing things in the UK really get me excited to try things here in the US that I don't see anyplace else. So that's one reason why I like this global audience, because we can all learn regardless of where we happen to be. It's just a wonderful time to be a gardener, I think. And every day is a good day to be a gardener. Let's go ahead and start rolling into the theme of today. A couple weeks ago, we talked about saving seeds and the idea of saving seeds, saving money, using the plants that did well in your garden this year and taking those seeds with the intent of growing them next year. That's the basic idea for this. If you know something worked well this year and you did save the seeds, or you still have time to save the seeds, then use that as the beginning point of next year's garden. Too often, and I try to have my garden mostly planned out by the beginning of the new year, but too often gardeners go into the planting season and they don't have a plan. They haven't thought about what's going into their beds. And so we all love looking at the seed catalogs. We all love cruising online to see what's out there. We'll buy this seed packet, we'll buy that seed packet, and then we'll put our garden together. And too often, and I've made this mistake way too many times, you buy a pack of seeds thinking, oh, this will be great in my garden. And then once you get it, you realize it's too late to actually put it in your garden. Because there are a lot of seeds that take time, tomatoes and peppers and eggplant in particular. If you're going to grow those in your garden, there are very few of us that can put a seed in the ground and expect it to grow. We need to grow all of those as plants and then put the plants in the garden. Well, generally, tomatoes are going to take 6 to 8 weeks minimum ahead of time to start indoors. Peppers could be 10 to 12 weeks ahead of time before you put them outdoors that you need to be starting them indoors. And so if you wait to buy all of your seeds, you could be too late in starting your garden in the most effective and most efficient way. So start with what you have right now. If you are harvesting those last ripe tomatoes and you want to plant the same tomato again next year, then go ahead and save those tomato seeds and make that part of next year's plan. Start thinking now about where you're going to put those plants. Could be the same bed, could be a different bed, but at least you've got a space sectioned out for those plants. I think I mentioned last week I have some Hungarian peppers, just one plant. And on that one plant, I've got 10 or 12 peppers. I've allowed those peppers to stay on the plant and fully ripen, fully mature, so that those pepper seeds are going to be as viable as possible. And that now becomes part of my plan for next year. Because this year I only grew one plant. It was a plant I bought at our garden club plant sale just to see how it would do, and it did great. So next year I want to grow multiple Hungarian pepper plants with the intent of making some Hungarian paprika. I'll harvest those peppers next year, dry the peppers, turn them into powder, and I've made paprika. It's that simple. And you'll probably see a video if it all works out right. Well, the planning for next year's garden has already started. I'm already trying to figure out which bed I'm going to put those peppers in. And I think I have it figured out. So this is my garden this morning. I'll talk about it here in a little bit. And so in this metal bed back here, that's where I'm planning on growing a whole bunch, probably 12 to 15, if not more, of those Hungarian pepper plants. Because peppers don't take up much space, and I don't imagine that each pepper is going to give much powder. So for me to make a lot of paprika like I'm planning to, I'm going to have to grow a lot of peppers, which means I need a lot of garden space. And now I've got to figure out which bed that's going to be, and I don't want to devote one of these wooden beds just to those peppers. But I will devote a stretch of these metal beds to those peppers. See how you can start thinking about how a single plant can occupy a space in your garden? I've already got that part figured out as far as that's concerned with that one type of plant. You can do the same with everything else. As I look at this bed back here, these are the tomatillos, and they didn't do as well as I had hoped. I want to do tomatillos again. I'm going to do tomatillos differently. So the tomatillo seeds that I have this year, I'm setting aside with the intent of growing tomatillos in their own dedicated space in the garden for next year. I haven't even planted anything. I'm still almost 9 months away from putting those plants in the ground, and I already have it figured out where they're going and what is going to be the substantial focus of my garden for next year. Francis, thank you so much for that contribution. I really appreciate it. Thanks for that super chat. It's nice to have you here today. I'm glad you can check in and join us live. This is just one of those times of the week that I just absolutely love. So let's go ahead. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Shandy's garden is wondering, can I save seeds once a fruit has been down to a light freeze? Discovered 2 giant cucumbers, and I've got a few ripe cherry tomatoes as well as a couple flowers. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, those ultra ripe cucumbers, those yellow, big, monstrous ones that are always hiding, that's really the ones that you want to save. And so too often we think that the fruit we're harvesting is producing the seeds we should plant, but that's not always the case, especially with something like cucumbers. When you harvest cucumbers, when they're nice and slender and green and delectable for eating, those seeds may not be fully mature and probably aren't going to be completely viable. When that cucumber becomes engorged and changes color and those seeds really become nice and big, that's the cucumber that you should be using to save seeds. So yes, that might absolutely be ideal. And the freeze really doesn't affect. The freeze affects the plant. It's not going to affect the seeds. The same with the cherry tomatoes or any type of tomato. If the fruit is ripe on the plant, and overripe is better, those are the seeds that you want to save. And so I think, and I've had this with cucumbers, with eggplants, with peppers, with tomatoes. There's often that ultra ripe fruit that is hidden by the leaves, and it takes a freeze that kills all the foliage to reveal that fruit on the inside. And that's the fruit that you should be harvesting and then saving the seeds from. So go for it. I think you're in an ideal position to get some of those seeds. Okay, let's see. Helen's saying, how's outsaving seeds from red bell peppers? Can that be grown in plants? Yeah, so this falls into that same category. If you save the seeds from green bell peppers, they're not fully mature. It's not a ripe fruit. And so those seeds are most likely not going to be as viable. You might get a few that'll grow, but probably not. When the green pepper turns red, now it's ripening. Now it's becoming mature, and it's the red bell pepper seeds that you should be saving. Here in Colorado, we recently had our Pueblo Chili Festival. The Pueblo chilies are actually becoming relatively world famous now because they're doing a lot of marketing. And like the Anaheim, they are an Anaheim chili, but like the Anaheim chili that you might be familiar with, we typically see those in the store as green chilies. They will turn red. And so this year when I bought my batch of Pueblo chilies and decided that I want to try to see if I can grow the same type of Pueblo chilies in my garden, I chose the chilies that had started turning red. There weren't any that were completely red, but I'm hoping that some of those might be viable because they were in that final ripening stage. And this is another example of I've saved these chili seeds from a few weeks ago as part of my planning for next year. You label them And I like to have a separate box, a separate location, so that as I come across my seed packets or as I save my own seeds, that's the box that identifies part of my garden plan for next year. And so those Pueblo chilies, along with all the tomato seeds I've been saving over the last few weeks, they're all going into that box. The tomatoes, I'm planning next year not to grow as many cherry tomatoes as I grew this year. I want to try growing a few different varieties. And so as I save my tomato seeds, I'm making a conscious decision to not save the cherry tomato seeds anymore because I saved them last year. I'm not saving my black crim seeds because I saved them last year. But I did save my Berkeley tie-dye seeds, which actually did pretty well in my garden this year. And I did save the black cherry tomatoes that actually did well in my garden last year. I had a small number that were given to me by Frank, but now I've saved a whole bunch more so that I will have them going into the future. And so when I talk about saving seeds for planting, it can extend beyond next year. Last year, I specifically saved seeds for the next 3 or 4 or 5 seasons, as long as those seeds last. This year, I'm doing the same thing. I'm saving seeds with the intent to use those seeds because I like them and because they did well. They will be in my garden for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. So garden planning is one of those things that really can be a challenge. But if you can plan out 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead because of the seeds you're saving right now, well, that makes each year's planning just that much easier. And that's kind of the way I like to look at it. So Little Biscuit's wondering, what's a good way to catalog and organize seeds? Good question. So I have a couple of videos on saving seeds. I've got one video in particular, I think I did it last year, on organizing seeds. And it's how you garden. And so the way I garden is I think in terms of this year I'm going to grow some beans. Now I don't know exactly what beans I'm going to grow, but I'm going to grow beans. And this year I'm going to grow tomatoes. Don't know exactly what kind of tomatoes, but I'm going to grow tomatoes. So I approach it from a large category perspective as to what plants I'm going to be growing in my garden. And then as I buy seeds and save seeds and then use seeds and then save those packets again, that's how I organize them. I organize them by grouping. So all of my bean seeds are together in the container that I show in that video. All of my tomato seeds are together. All of my pepper seeds are together. And that's my going into winter approach for organizing and saving my seeds. Then as we get closer to the growing season, I have my separate box of the seeds that I'm going to grow in that season. So it's like a 2-tier planning effect. So then I'll go to my bean seed collection and decide what bean seeds I'm going to grow. And I put them into my next year's box. And I do that in all the categories. Well, sometimes, like I mentioned a little while ago, I've already put some seeds into that next year box. So the way I organize seeds is with different boxes. Plastic boxes, cardboard boxes, whatever you happen to have. And they're organized based on what time of year it is. I have another box that is this year's garden, the seeds that I grew. So all of the seeds I put into the ground in April and May and June and July, after I put those seeds in the ground, I saved that packet and put it into a separate box. And that box is these are the plants I grew this year box. And so now, at this time of year, when I'm saving my seeds, I already have those seed packets. And so I go through my box of the ones that I just grew and then decide, do I put them into the long-term storage where all the bean seeds go together and all the tomato seeds go together? Or do I take out some of those packets and put them into, I'm definitely growing these next year box? And so, for example, I mentioned it in a recent video, a couple different types of cucumbers. I'm not growing again. I'm not planting it. I may not even put those into my broad category box. I may put those in my giveaway box, because that's a whole nother category of saving the seeds, the ones that I'm going to give away. This week, I fixed a nice dinner and had delicata squash. I grew delicata squash this year. I'd never eaten it. It's a winter squash. This year I thought, I'll try it. Beautiful squash. Amazingly delicious. I was not thinking that I was going to plant delicata squash next year, but now definitely I'm going to do it. I'm probably not going to do the yellow squash like I normally do. I might do something like delicata instead. But now, as far as the categorizing, those seeds are going to move from the I just planted them this year box into the I'm going to definitely plant them next year box. So that's what works for me. That's how I categorize, because I've got multiple boxes. You can set up a spreadsheet. You can put together whatever series of boxes or containers you like to use, but it should match with how you garden and how you do your planning. And I think that starts at this time of year. So definitely start thinking about those kind of things as you put it all together. So thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. To submit a background image, send to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com. And I'll be talking about my background here in just a little bit. But I'd love to see pictures of your garden as they change season. And not just those of you in the Northern Hemisphere that have the gardens that are beginning to fade, but I'd love to see the brand new garden pictures from those of you in South Africa or Australia, the ones that are just starting out your system or your season. So thank you, Jay. I appreciate that reminder, because I am looking for some more photos in the background. And it's a wonderful time, I think, to share some of those things. Hi, Robin's Container Garden. And so Robin's got a channel also in Scotland that you should check out. I helped out with a video and submitted some stuff, and hopefully we'll be seeing that video soon on Robin's Container Garden. She says, I map out my garden every year, so it helps me figure out how many of each plant I need to grow. Great idea. And this plays in very well with that idea of figuring out what you're going to grow well ahead of time, because I know I have this problem, is I have that box of these are the plants I'm going to grow. And then when I actually have to sit down and figure out what beds they're going into, I always have way too many seed packets and way too many plants that I am planning to grow. And so mapping out the garden and figuring it out really makes a difference, because if you don't have it mapped out, if you just have a bunch of seed packets, and I've been guilty of this, I think many of us have done it and probably still do, just take a bunch of seed packets and go out in the garden and figure out, oh, okay, now what? Which bed is this going into? How many of these plants am I going to put? And then you start putting the seeds in, and you like a particular bean or you like a particular squash, and you put those, and then you suddenly realize you've taken up most of the bed and there's not enough room left for the other plants that you had intended on growing in that bed. So I agree with you, Robin. I think mapping out the garden each year is definitely a great way to approach the planning so that you don't overdo it too much. And then try to stick with the plan. I did a series of videos this year where I was talking about survival gardens, and I showed some of the methods I use to actually map out the individual garden beds so that you can figure out how much space the plant is going to take and how many plants you're going to put in. And then when I put those seeds in the ground, I stayed pretty close to my intended plan, and it worked out great. And it really did make it easier to have that figured out ahead of time. So, okay, let's see. I know I'm behind, so I'm scrolling down. Linda says, my seeds are in a closet in the house. I'm presently harvesting seeds and storing them in envelopes. I worry about dampness. Would it be wise to put silica gel packets with freshly harvested seeds? Generally, I say yes. Now, some of us live in very dry regions, as I've already said. And so for me, my house hold humidity in winter is very, very dry. And so I can save seeds and expect them to continue to dry out, even in storage. For the rest of the world that has average humidity and especially high humidity, yeah, putting those gelica or the silica gel packets in can make a big difference. It can help keep some mold from developing. It can help keep the seeds dry, and it might make a difference. And I just use the silica gel packets that I get in every shipment that's got any type of electrical device or electronic device in it. It's got those little packets. I just throw those in. And I throw them in even though I know I've got a low humidity. I would think that's just a nice habit to get into, because you never know when the humidity is going to be changed at the place you're storing your seed. You should be storing your seed when it is completely dry. But occasionally we think the seed is dry enough to save, and it really isn't. And so that's where the silica gel packets can make a difference if you inadvertently start saving some seeds that haven't dried out enough. And then at that point you can save them. And I like to do what Gardens Happen is suggesting, is letting the husks or the pods or whatever is on the plant, the flower head, let it dry completely on the plant, then harvest it, then bring it inside, then allow it to continue drying on parchment paper or wax paper or paper plate. And after a couple of weeks of that additional drying indoors, that's the point. I usually put them into storage just to be on the safe side. It's one of those things that it's very difficult to have seeds that are too dry in storage. If you were to try to dry your seeds in an oven, for instance, then yes, it's possible you could kill the seeds by making them too dry. But for the most part, we're not going to have that problem if you're just air drying your seeds. Hi, Pepper Chris. Is there a general amount of time seeds can be saved? I know they all have different decay times in general. And so, in general, you can expect seeds to last at least 3 years. Almost all seeds will last at least 3 years. Now, there are some seeds like onions and leeks that are really most viable in their first year. And I've planted some and had some germination at the 3-year point, but very little. Some seeds like carrots, for instance, they'll last 3 years with no problem. I have planted some with low germination rates at the 4-year point. Others, like tomatoes and peppers, I've planted 5 and 6-year-old seeds and had complete germination. So it does depend on the seed. Generally, 3 years is a good time frame. So for specific seeds and that future planning idea, this is a really good point that Chris brings up. If you want to save your own seeds, when it comes to something like onions, then you should be saving onion seeds every single year. And the onions are biennial, which means you need to leave some onions in the ground over the winter to let flower and then harvest the seed the next year. And you need to keep that cycle going and pretty much harvest onion seeds every single year with some of the seed or some of the plants staying in the ground. With others, like the tomatoes and peppers that can easily last 5 years, you only need to save your seeds every 3 or 4 or 5 years, depending on how many seeds you have. So I like to be on a 3-year cycle generally for my peppers and tomatoes. So last year I saved black crim tomatoes, and 3 years from last year, so 2 years from now, I'll probably save my black crim again, just so I have fresher seed, so that 3 years, again, being a general target. I try not to plant seeds that are older than 3 years. I know they can last longer, but that's usually the target I look for, because most of what we grow can stay viable for 3 years. And so that's what I use as my general guideline. In the garden with Eli and Kate, going to be growing black cherry for the first time. Robin's Container Garden shared seeds with me. Good for you. I'm not sure if you, I think you did see that short. I did a short video last month, I think it was, where I actually had my very first taste of the black cherry that I found. Delicious. That's why I'm saving the seeds this year. And that's why I'm planning now for the next 3 years to be growing the black cherry in the garden. Delicious, delicious tomato. I really was impressed, and it did pretty well. It wasn't as prolific or productive as like the Sun Gold or the Sweet 100, but the flavor is really, really nice. Sonia says, I'm still in the trying stage. Want to see what will grow. Problems with pests, production, still seems to have a problem growing peppers, not good at it, putting 4 more 20 by 30 beds for spring. Good for you. And that also raises another good point, that keep trying stuff, keep growing, keep experimenting, keep expanding your beds. But when you find the thing that does work, that's when you can start thinking about saving seeds. I gardened for a long time before I got serious about saving seeds, because I was always trying that something new, and I was always trying to see what would work. And once you find that thing, stick with it. There was a green bean that I grew for 10 years, and it was the first green bean I grew that I had success with, that did really well in my garden. So every year I saved those seeds. And I think I've mentioned in the past, I've told this story, that I lost the seeds in a move from one house to another. And now I don't know what that seed was, what kind of plant it was specifically, because once I grew it, I just knew it was my green bean seed. I actually stopped putting plant tags in it, and so I'm not sure exactly what variety it was. So I'm still on that search for that seed. Rattlesnake seeds are a seed that I'm now in that category of. Every 2 or 3 years, I'm saving my rattlesnake bean seeds to get enough to grow for the next 2 or 3 years. And that's another factor in your planning and your seed saving. Depending on how many seeds you can save will determine how many years you can grow that plant before you need to save the seeds again. And so think about that as part of your planning. And Sonia, just keep growing and keep experimenting. And as you find those plants, start saving the seeds, and it'll all work out well. Shandy says, I think my new favorite is Berkeley tie-dye. First time growing it. Beautiful and tasty. Just had my last slices this morning on an egg sandwich. That sounds good. I still have one left that I'm going to be putting into a salad either tonight or tomorrow. But yeah, I tried growing the Berkeley tie-dye a few times over the years, and it did okay, but this year it just did great. And so I saved the seeds from the plant that did great this year. It's one of those things when we talk about the plan and whether we're going to save the seeds or not, it may not be a good idea to save the seeds from the plants that don't do well in your garden. And so because the Berkeley tie-dye tomatoes for me haven't done great in the past, I've never saved those seeds before. So it might be something about this one plant. Maybe there was some genetic modification. There was something about my garden. There was something about that bed, whatever. I've saved the seeds from that plant to grow next year into the future. I'll have enough seeds for at least the next 3 or 4 years, and we'll continue to track it and see if it does as well as I hope it does, because that's really the intent. Is it does well, you save the seeds, you hope it does well, and if it doesn't go well, I usually give it at least one more chance and then decide whether it deserves a place in the permanent garden or not. Llama is still in the process of figuring out how to organize seeds. I've tried a few different things, but I'm definitely in need of a better solution. I like the photo organizer idea like Eli and Kate. Yeah, and that's the main box I use, is the same photo organizing box. It really does work out pretty well. Chris is wondering, is there a general amount of time? Oh, I think I already just answered this. I thought I was scrolling down, but maybe I scrolled up by mistake. So Brian says, by accident, I discovered an easy way to separate heavy seeds from chaff. was collecting cardinal climber seeds into a jar, and the wind created a mini cyclone within the jar, blowing out the chaff. Nice. Yes. I'll do that. I'll put my seeds in a jar and I'll blow, or into a bowl, and I'll blow into it as well. I think that can be pretty effective. Greg, I'm unable to purchase compost to amend my beds for fall. I only cover with shredded leaves. I will be able to add compost in spring. Is there anything you would do differently? No, great idea. Definitely cover your beds for fall. The thing to think about in the spring is that I encourage that you give your soil at least 2 months, if you can, for the soil organisms to really get into that new compost, to get into that amended material. And so as soon as you can work your beds in the spring, that's when you would want to work your compost in, so that at least a month goes by. There's still going to be undecomposed material in that compost, and it takes the soil bacteria to break down that material. Well, the more decomposed material, the bacteria gets right at it, and even the bacteria from the compost pile will help break it down and release those nutrients into the soil. But for the bits that aren't decomposed yet, it requires nitrogen. All those microbes are using nitrogen to break down that material. And so if you put plants in right away, well, the compost, that organic material, is going to be first in line to use the nitrogen, which could cause a deficiency, and your plants could suffer, because your plants are going to need that nitrogen for their nice new young green growth. So by giving them a month to 2 months, the soil microbes, the opportunity to break down that material and release all of the nutrients into the soil for the plants, then your plants will do better. So I wouldn't necessarily do anything differently, Greg. Just try to get as much of a head start as possible when you get going. And so Eli's wondering what the humidity is in my garden. It's dry. I don't know what it is right now. I do know a couple days ago we had between 12 and 14% humidity. We haven't had any rain. I can't remember the last time we've had rain. It's been weeks and weeks. And so there's a chance we're getting something on Thursday, but absolutely crazy dry in our area. So yeah, Tony's right, talking about the drying of the seeds. If there's any doubt when you're saving your seeds, it's better to just let them dry. And that's a good tip from John. If you don't have those silica gel packets, put the rice grains, dry rice grains, in with your seeds. That's a good suggestion as well. So, okay, let's see. Oh, there you go. Robin's video that has a clip from me and also Eli will be on Sunday. So I'll look for it there. Great to know that's coming. I just checked out your channel this morning and saw that it wasn't there. So I'm looking forward to seeing when it's going to come out. Gardens Happen has gotten germination of 5-year-old dill seeds before. That's pretty good. Herbs tend to last pretty well, but 3 is a good target. So good to hear that you had success with 5-year-old seed. Joe's Crayons, good morning to you as well. Just reading some Goosebumps books while watching the stream. That's great. Also, I just got a pumpkin not so long ago, and I'm planning on planting the seeds. Good for you. And I hope it does well in your garden. I know my kids love the Goosebump books, and I think this time of year around Halloween, my granddaughters are getting into Goosebumps now as well. So that's funny. Nick from Yuma, how do I prevent seeds in compost from sprouting up the next year? Or is that dumb to try to stop? No, it's not dumb at all. And so I saw that Jay had put a link to Tony O'Neill's book, Compost Masterclass. And he talks about that and as far as the composting is concerned, because the way to keep the seeds from sprouting is to have a hot compost pile. When you can get your compost pile above 140 degrees Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius, when you can start getting heats above that, the temperatures of the pile, it's enough to kill the seeds. And so the prevention is to get a hot pile. So it's not dumb to try to stop at all. what you should be trying to do if that's your goal, is try to get as hot a pile as possible. And so Tony's book talks about the different methods. You got to make sure you're balancing the nitrogens and the carbons and the oxygen and the moisture and putting all those pieces together. And then you get the high temperatures. And not only will it kill the seeds, it'll kill weed seeds, it'll kill whatever seeds from anything you're composting, but it can also kill those diseases, the fungi that can cause damage to your plants. That's why you want to get a nice hot pile. If you don't have a hot pile, I don't run a hot pile like that. I will go ahead and allow my cool pile to decompose. I'll use that compost knowing that any seeds in that compost will probably sprout. And that's why I just use that compost in these beds, because I'm watering and tending to these beds every single day. As soon as I see something sprout that is not something I put there, it's a weed and I pull it. So I personally don't worry that much about seeds in my compost because I'm only using them in selected beds, and I'm weeding those beds on almost a daily basis. And so prevention is heat. Or, like I do, you just allow it and then you'll pull them up whenever they happen to sprout, and it's not that big of a problem. Raydell, I use old egg cartons to allow my seeds to dry. Works better than anything else I've tried. That's a good idea. Now, I'm assuming you're talking about the pressed paper or the cardboard egg cartons, because I have used the styrofoam egg cartons before to save my seeds, and they don't wick up the moisture. They'll actually allow the moisture to stay in place. So I completely agree with you. If you're using the paper or cardboard egg cartons, they are an excellent way to dry your seeds in New Jersey. Nice to have you here, Ray. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. So much good stuff there. 54 cows wondering, is there any truth in only saving seeds from only the largest fruit? There really isn't. And so the genetics of the seeds are going to be pretty consistent on the same plant. And so the plant is producing the genetics for that fruit. Cross-pollination has zero effect on the size of the fruit in any given year. So if you have a big plant next door and it pollinates the little plant, that's not going to make the fruit bigger. There might be a difference in the second season, but what the individual plant is doing is just producing the genetics from that plant in that season. And so the previous year is what will affect the size of the fruit. And so in any given season, if you've got a plant that has bigger fruit on it, it's more likely a timing issue or a weather issue or the amount of water that plant happened to absorb when that one fruit was developing. And those conditions were different for the second fruit. Now, that being said, the bigger fruit may ripen faster. It may actually get to the point that it is the one you should choose for selecting your seeds, because it's a bigger fruit, probably has more seeds, and those seeds are probably going to be bigger because the fruit is bigger and riper. But you should be able to save the seeds from smaller fruit on that same plant, mix them all together, and the next year plant them, and you wouldn't be able to tell which seeds came from the big fruit and which seeds came from the little fruit. It's all about the pollination. And if it's a plant like a tomato, for instance, that usually self-pollinates, I'll pick the bigger fruit to save seed just because I know that there's more seeds typically in a bigger fruit. But that plant should give me the same results. The seed from that plant should give me the same results in the following year, even if I just picked a medium-sized tomato to save my seeds from. And sometimes, like this year, I did that. I had some of the big fruit that was eaten by the mice in my garden, And I ended up saving the seeds from medium-sized fruit. Didn't even worry about what's going to happen next year, because it really isn't the size of the fruit that makes the difference for the following season. It's the genetics of the parent plant and whatever else was involved with the pollination of that particular flower. So let's see. Lance says, have a young peach tree in a pot. Do I bring it in for the winter? Depends on where you live. And it depends on how cold your winters get. So for me, I'm in zone 5B. I've got peach trees growing outside. And the varieties I've grown or that I chose can handle a zone 5B winter. That's minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And what is that? Minus 20? Oh, no, that's minus 25 degrees Celsius. And so they're okay outside. Now, in a container, I suggest that you raise your zone by at least 1, because containers, the soil tends to, if you're in a really cold winter area, it tends to freeze solid a little bit earlier and a little bit differently than in the ground. And the soil tends to dry out, particularly when it gets into that frozen mode. And so when I grow plants in containers, if it is a zone 5 peach tree and you live in zone 5 and it's in a container, I would probably bring it in. If it is a zone 5 peach tree and you live in zone 6, then you probably don't need to worry as much about leaving it in a container, because you have that extra buffer for those cold temperatures. And so it depends on where you are in your zone and the variety of peach tree that you're growing. I would say if you're in zone 6 or above, you're probably okay leaving it in a container. If it's colder than that, I would consider, just in general, for most peach trees, I would consider bringing it in for the winter. And it still should have some cold conditions. I mean, you can put it into a shed or a garage, but it's one of those things where it is sheltered from the wind and the cold and any other winter conditions that you might have. So, okay, let's see. Eli says they're at 84% humidity right now. That's funny. I think the only time we have 84% humidity is when we're actually in the rain. Other than that, it just doesn't reach that point. So that's funny. Interesting to see how everybody has differences all around. Shandy's garden. I'll be grilling some micro tomatoes indoors called Orange Hot. Interesting. They say they only get 9 inches tall maximum, but need full sun. Can I save seeds without full sun if they fully ripen? Oh yeah, yeah. If the fruit is fully ripe, then you can save the seeds. The seed doesn't know whether it's in the sun or not. The plant knows whether it's in the sun or not, and it is sending its energy to ripen the fruit. And so even in low light conditions, the fruit will still ripen, and you can still save the seeds as long as they have fully matured. So I wouldn't be so worried about the full sun as long as the plant is getting enough sun to cause the maturity of those particular plants and fruits that you're growing. Tony says, worked hard on that book, guys. Loads of people seeing great results. Yeah, it is a good book. I was just looking at it again a week or two ago. Great reference book. I've got it on my bookshelf almost within arm's reach. And I've got most of my reference garden books right there. So if I am in research mode for a video, or if I just am killing time, I've got those gardening books right there. And I'll actually be talking about that at the end of the video today, as far as how you can think into the future and your planning by getting that information. Make it easy. Put it right by your hand. And so if you don't have Tony's book, great holiday gift. Something to think about. Nigel, hello to you in Turkey. Nice to see you add to our global audience. And this is just so fantastic that we have people from all over the world that are sharing our gardening time together. This is just, I just love it. You hear me say it all the time, but I really do love getting together with all of you on Mondays. Wish we could do it every day, but I think it would become tiresome at some point. So I'm not planning on going to every day anytime soon. So Northchester County News made hydrangea cuttings and they're rooted in Zone 5B. How should I overwinter them? This also falls into that general category where even though a plant can do well in the ground, in the winter, it might not do as well in a container. And newly rooted plants can really suffer in a pot if they're not protected. So particularly for cuttings, even if they're wintered, I would move them into an area that is near freezing or slightly below freezing. So for you, Zone 5B, you also get as cold as I do, that minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. And so I would put them in a location that, just to be safe, stays above 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's in the minus 7 degree range for Celsius. And so that just helps ensure that those pots don't get too cold. They can handle freezing conditions, but it's when they get the soil fully frozen and then you have that icy wind blow through that desiccates the plant. That's what you're trying to avoid. So I've had pretty good success with cuttings, not hydrangeas specifically, but putting them into my garage. My garage is not heated. It does get below freezing, but it never gets below that 20 degree range. And you also need to make sure that the soil doesn't dry out because those roots are alive. And so you'll need to water them periodically so that the pots don't dry and the plants don't desiccate. And then when things start warming up in spring and the nighttime temperatures start staying above 20 degrees Fahrenheit or so, you could start moving them outside and they should be okay. But I would protect new cuttings. I tried with my a few of the plants. I had some yew plants that I had done from cuttings, and I had a few others that I was trying to root. I had a boxwood, and I took the same cuttings that I knew were rooted in fall and kept some indoors in my basement, and then kept some outside in the open air. And the ones on the open air in my 5B didn't make it through the winter, but the ones that were inside and protected did. And so, that is just one of those things, that's how much effort you want to put into it. But for the best success, I would suggest putting them into a sheltered area, and then everything should be okay. But you still need to water it. That's an important aspect of it. So, and we got Rick on board with us today. Nice to see you, Rick, in Australia. I've talked about Rick before, and some of our live streams, staying up really, really late or getting up really, really early. So I'm glad you're here with us, Rick. And I'm not sure if you were on earlier when I was talking about photos for the background. I'd love to see a picture of your garden, Rick, as you're starting your season in Australia, and the rest of us are finishing our seasons up here. Send me a photo to gardenerscout@gardenerscout.com. I'd love to show a background for those of us that are looking to see what others are doing in other parts of the world. Jay says, we're nestled between Great Lakes, and humidity occasionally gets to close to 100%, swimming through the air. Wow. Yeah, my son is in Louisiana, near the Gulf, and same thing, 90% humidity is also a daily occurrence for them. I'm not a big fan of the humidity. And so let's go ahead. Oh, there's Frank. And Frank's just down the road from me here in Colorado. Can I save okra seeds from pods that didn't dry on the plant? Cut some off, but not enough for a meal. Yeah, you can definitely save them. The question is whether they're going to be viable. And so one thing that you can do, and this holds true with any seed, if you are saving seed, and you're saving it from a fruit or from a pod that didn't dry on the plant, and you're not sure if it's viable and worth saving, go ahead and do a germination test. Go ahead and take the seeds, you can let them dry out, and when you've got time, then do a germination test. A wet paper towel or some tissue, put any number of seeds. 10 is usually the number that we choose. But put 10 seeds on a moist paper towel, put it inside a plastic bag, and see how many germinate. You may get 10 out of 10. That tells you that the rest of those seeds that you've saved are viable. Put them into your seed saver for this season and next season, and however often you're going to be planting those plants, and you're good to go. If you do a germination test and nothing sprouts, then you know that it's not worth your time to save all the rest of those seeds. So yeah, you can actually absolutely save them. It's just a question of whether you want to save them until next year for planting, because you can find out sooner if they're going to be good enough or not. So we talked about humidity. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the weather and the temperature. And so I took this in my garden today, and this is what 25 degrees Fahrenheit looks like. That's -4 Celsius. And so while I had a few days below freezing this last week, this was my first hard freeze, and I was ready for it. You can already see that I've cleaned out most of my beds. I just had a few plants. I was waiting to kind of see how they would struggle through the weather, but they're being pulled this week as well. But it's cold today. We have a high temperature that's supposed to be around 42 degrees, that's 6 degrees Celsius. And just a few days ago, we were just over 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 22 Celsius. That's what Jean-Pierre is enjoying in Belgium. And so I just wanted to talk about it today because some of us have a roller coaster weather pattern. I know most of you will be cold, and then you get colder, and then you get colder still, and especially when you have the humidity in that cold, that can be quite miserable. And then it gradually warms up, you still have the humidity, but then you get into the next growing season. Where for me, it's hot, it's cold, it's hot, it's cold, but it usually stays dry the whole time. So when I was out taking this picture, I wasn't wearing a jacket. It was that cold, but it really didn't feel that cold. It was just after sunrise and no wind, very low humidity. And so those of us that live in these conditions get used to it, and we'll walk outside just in shirt sleeves, no warm jacket, and it's no big deal. So just wanted to share that with you. I also did want to point out, because I've been talking about it in recent weeks, about cleaning up your beds and taking a slow approach to it. And so these two beds are the ones that I planted the garlic in. And so those were the beds that I focused on most recently to make sure they were clean and amended. And then I put the garlic in, and you can kind of see it. It's kind of a side picture, but you can see I've got straw in all these beds mixed with dried leaves. That's the mulch I like to use going into the winter. But all these beds back here, that video I just released about cleaning up your tomato beds, that's this whole section. And so that area is also cleaned up. And so really all I've got to do is clean up this bed with those pepper plants and clean up this bed with those tomatoes and those tomatillos. And my vegetable garden is done. It's put to sleep for the winter. The soil's been amended. The mulch is in place. And now I can start shifting to saving seeds, doing germination tests, doing the planning for this next season. And I don't have to worry about any of those chores when it comes to the cleanup of the garden. And so like we're talking about with the spring amending of the soil, because I amended everything in the fall, I don't even need to worry about amending. I can get straight to seed sowing and straight to transplanting as soon as my soil temperatures and the weather allow for it next spring. So just wanted to show you the example of what my garden begins to look like going into the winter. Purely up to you as to when you clean your beds. I just like to get ahead of it because it was 70 degrees a couple days ago. It was wonderful weather. I was out in a t-shirt cleaning up my beds and didn't have to worry about bundling up. I just don't like working out in the garden when it's frigid. So I prefer to do it when it's still warm. And I have done a little thing different. So I've got my cattle panel hoops here and hoops here and hoops here and hoops here. I've got hoops on all of my beds because I was just watching it today. I think I'll release it as a short. But Mala is doing a great job of chasing the deer away. She does such a good job that wherever she's at in the garden, she just beelines for the rabbits or even the birds that are in her view to chase them away. Well, in springtime, this one bed back here, that's where I had my garlic. She was with me in the garden and saw something she wanted to chase away, did a beeline, and for the first time she ran over the bed right on top of some of my garlic plants that were just starting to sprout. So for that, I'm now protecting all of my beds with those strong metal hoops just so Mala doesn't inadvertently run across the beds. So that's something new. That's one of those lessons learned and something I'm doing a little bit differently. But I have enough of those hoops to make sure that all of my beds have something in place to keep the deer or Mala or whatever else from actually disturbing the soil. And then it's ready. You can see these are my sugar pumpkins. I should have brought them in last night. They'll be okay today, even with that hard freeze, because I'll be roasting them and using the pulp to make pumpkin pie here pretty soon. But I'm essentially done with my outdoor gardening with this cold weather that we had overnight and more cold weather on the way. So I'll be doing a lot more indoor videos to come. We'll have to wait and see what actually ends up coming. Mary says snowing, doing the other side of gardening today, canning all those tomatoes, apples, etc. that have been in the freezer for the day when I can do it. And that's exactly what I'm doing today too. I'm going to be starting my hot pepper sauce, and you'll be seeing a video on that here in a couple weeks. So I'm fermenting some hot peppers. I'm starting on that today. I've also got still some of the yellow squash that I'm going to be freeze drying, and it's also time for me at least to do jams and jellies. And so the peppers that I was telling you about, the Pueblo chili peppers, I bought roasted chili peppers. They actually roast them right in front of you, and I'll be making some roasted pepper concoctions. I've already done some freeze drying. Beautiful snack. A freeze-dried roasted chili pepper is actually really, really tasty. But one of my favorites is to actually make a roasted pepper jam. And I've been looking for that recipe. I think it's on one of my old computers. So I need to pull out that computer and gin it up and try to find that recipe, because that's what I'll be doing on my cold days as well, is doing all that kind of preservation kind of stuff. So Chris is wondering, I have a weeping cherry blossom tree from a cutting. I didn't let it overwinter last year. If I do this year, will it be okay? Possibly. It's one of those things that, like we were talking about earlier, particularly if you move into sheltered areas, and if they're a cutting and struggling, then I can't guarantee that it'll be okay. But putting it into a sheltered area can definitely help. Definitely help. Tony says, so glad I'm ready to film indoors. Yeah, I'm looking forward to some of your videos. Tony just completed a project with a studio where he's going to be doing a lot of indoor filming. And so I look forward to seeing what you have along those lines, Tony. Sunset Gazing, homemade roasted pumpkin seeds sound good right now. Pumpkin pie and pumpkin candy too. Absolutely. And that's why I was pointing out these sugar pumpkins, because I'm planning on pumpkin pie and pumpkin bread. I hadn't thought about pumpkin candy, but that's a wonderful idea. So maybe I'll do something along those lines as well. So Greg Hill says, one of my hobbies is making hot sauce with my peppers, both fermented and cooked sauces. I'll be doing fermentation. And so I'm actually going to be doing a green sauce with my jalapenos, and I'll be doing a red sauce with the Anaheims that I've allowed to ripen on the plant, and then a whole bunch of cayenne peppers that I grew this year with the intent on making my hot sauce. Terry says, I've treated grub worms in my garden bed. How often do I need to repeat the treatment? So it depends on what kind of treatment you use. Just follow the directions. I've talked about some of those soil-borne pests this last week, I think. It's if you are amending your soil by turning it and you are exposing those grubs in spring. This is one of those times when I think spring amending is actually a good idea, so that you can bring those grubs that are buried up to the surface for you to either pick out or for the birds to get to. And so if you do something like that, then a single treatment might be enough. If you can disturb their life cycle, you've given them a treatment to kill them, and then you disturb the pupa and the grubs themselves, the larvae, then you might not need another treatment. If you're doing no dig, and so you have to go through a life cycle or two, that's another critical part of when you put chemical treatments for pest control. You need to make sure you do it at the right time in their life cycle for it to be effective. And so look at the directions of whatever it is you're using, because it should tell you the time of year or how often to reapply, with that idea in mind. That if you have a treatment that's going to affect the grubs, but then you do it too late and they've already emerged from the soil, then it's not going to have any effect whatsoever. So the directions on the package or wherever it is you're getting the information about that treatment should give some guidance along those lines. Okay, let's see. Shandy's Garden, I have some question about mowing over stuff, considering it. Hope he answers that. Okay, so I didn't see let's see if I can scroll up and see if I see another question. Oh, there you go. Janan is wondering, for my cleanup, would it be okay to just remove my trellis and mow over my tomatoes and pumpkin vines? There's been no disease, and I'll be planting in the same area next year. Oh, sure, no problem whatsoever. And this holds true. I talked a little bit about it in that video where I'm cleaning up my tomato beds. The issue that I think is one that you should be aware of is the size of the root. Now, leaving roots in the soil is a good idea. The microbes in the soil actually develop relationships with roots. And so your soil will be healthier whenever there are roots growing in it, which is another great reason why you should do cover crops in the fall, because you're making your soil richer, not only because of the biomass growing above, but because the roots will actually benefit the soil. The issue is particularly with tomatoes. Tomatoes can have a pretty extensive root system, and some of those roots can get pretty big, and they can get pretty woody. And so they may not decompose in the soil. Mowing off works fine with whatever you have. Cucumbers are a great plant to just mow over because their roots don't have the same root woodiness and thickness like a tomato plant would have. And so when you go to plant next year, this is where the issue comes in. Those tomato roots may not be decomposed and probably won't be decomposed in the soil. So if you leave them in place and then plant or sow seeds in that same spot, as those new roots are growing, the old roots might interfere with that growth. And so you may stunt the new plant because it just doesn't have room. The roots just don't have enough soil because those old tomato roots are still in place. Now, if you're in a warmer area where the soil doesn't freeze like it does for me, and you keep your soil moist over the winter months, then it increases the likelihood of those roots decomposing. But roots have a different cellular structure than the plants. And so while we can take our plants and put them into compost and they'll break down, you can take the roots and put them into your compost and they're not going to break down at the same rate because of the different type of cells that are in the root. And so I prefer to pull my tomato roots. Totally up to you. But the mowing is an easy way to add that organic matter. You can mow with a bag and then put the bagged material into your compost pile, or just use a mulching mower blade and let it fall right back down to your soil, and that'll help enrich the soil from above. So the pumpkin vine, yeah, that I would consider mowing and not worry too much about the roots. It's just the roots of the tomato plants in particular that I've had issues with in the past, and that's why I like to pull them. And inevitably, especially with my cool composting, the tomato roots, as I turn my pile, everything else is breaking down, and the tomato roots are still identifiable as tomato roots, and that's why I mention it. Robin says, I grow my tomatoes in containers so tomato roots die off and break down over the winter. They don't get too deep in the container. And so that's another good point to bring up. My plants are growing tall and with a lot of growth, and my roots tend to be bigger. Container gardening is going to keep the plant smaller, and the roots aren't going to be as bad. And so especially Robin's in Scotland, especially with a milder, relatively speaking, winter and all the moist soil, it's going to break down much quicker than it does in an area like mine that's so dry and so cold. Poonam is wondering, do rose plants need to be covered in winter? It depends. Depends on what varieties you're growing, and it depends on how harsh your winters are. Even here for me in my Zone 5B garden, as long as I'm growing the roses that are appropriate for my zone, I don't cover my roses. I don't do anything to my roses. I don't know anyone in my area that does anything with their roses, because we've chosen the varieties that can handle our winters. If you're trying to grow a plant that is a zone or two above, and I do know a few gardeners that will do this, we're in Zone 5. They'll grow roses that are good down to Zone 6, and they'll wrap up their roses in winter. And a method that's often used is to put like a wire cage around it and then to fill the cage with dried leaves. Just some way to insulate that plant a little bit going into the winter, because that specific plant can't handle the cold conditions of that garden. And so normally, Poonam, I would say if you've chosen the right plants for where you live, it shouldn't be an issue. And so look into that. And if you find out that it is a variety that might not be able to handle your winter conditions, then yes, you might need to cover them. Nick the gardener, hello to you. I'm rearranging my plot, but I sowed a cover crop where my paths will be. I'm either going to do a double bed. Is there more to that? I think, yes, I'm trying to interpret what you're saying. So where your path is now, you're growing a cover crop to then use the path this year as a bed next year, because you've got the cover crop to enrich that soil. Wonderful idea. That doubles your garden space. And cover crops, because they can benefit the soil in so many ways, is actually a good idea of how to convert a garden path to a garden bed. So if that's what you're talking about, great idea. I think using a cover crop in the winter months in an area that used to be a path and next year will be a planned garden bed is a great way to do some of your planning. So good for you. And so I did this last year when we're talking about seeds and cover crops. I sowed a broad array of cover crop seeds in a number of my beds, knowing that some of those seeds were going to sprout and grow and benefit the soil in different ways. And some of the seeds were not, because I did a sowing later in the year for many of my beds. And so that's why in a lot of my videos, particularly in this garden bed back here, which is where I did it, you'll see the cover crops that were still growing among my tomato plants. So daikon radishes, for instance. I was worried in that area with compacted soil because I'd only amended it once. And so I was growing daikon radishes as a cover crop amongst my tomato plants to help break up that soil and keep it from being compacted during the growing season. And so as you're planning your cover crops to improve like a pathway, you could do something like that now. You could sow daikon radish seeds now, expecting that they will germinate and grow in the spring. And pathways tend to be compacted because that's where we're walking. And so something like a daikon radish as a cover crop can help break up that soil for what's going to end up being a future bed. So modify your cover crops for the purpose that you're planning to use them for, and hopefully that'll help. Northchester County News: let my greens go to seed to capture seeds. Now they're growing in my paths. You know, I had that problem with, I think I mentioned it a little while back, the onion seeds at the Galileo School Garden, where I was growing onions to collect the seed, and they just sprouted everywhere. And every year there would be more onions growing in the pathways, it seemed, than were actually growing in the beds. So that is one of those things when you sometimes let your plants go to seed, they'll escape outside the bed that you were intending them to grow into. Shandy's garden just created a bed from an old path, and everything is broken down there much quicker because I've been working on it. Good for you. The earth looks great. Makes me think I should move back and forth sometimes. And so I like that idea. If you're growing in ground, you know, for those of us that are growing in raised beds, we don't necessarily have that option, or we're limited in that option. But if you're growing in a plot and you always use the same pathway, break it up. Go ahead and mix it up. Because what often happens, and this is where the soil magic comes into play. We're focusing on amending our primary beds, but the nutrients are still flowing into the pathways. The microbes, the earthworms, all the other organisms are still working on that soil underneath. And so your pathway soil may be beautiful soil, and because no plants have grown in it, it's packed with nutrients. So by shifting your pathway just a few feet, you can now take all that wonderful soil that's in your pathway and start growing plants in it. Compaction is really the biggest issue to confront. But, oh yeah, I like that idea. I think you should consider mixing things up a little bit. And it doesn't need to be a complete shift. You don't even need to move the bed sideways. Move them perpendicular. So if your pathways have always run north-south, shift to pathways that are running east-west. And that might actually make it a little bit easier for you to modify your garden plan and grow things differently. So mix it up, experiment, try some of those new things. And it's definitely something that I do that. So these beds are all running north-south. But these, you can see the metal bed in the background, and also the metal beds I have in the interior back here. Those are east-west. So I intentionally have put in some east-west beds, even though I'm primarily growing in north-south beds, because it does change the opportunities and how you grow your plants, and it really can stretch you in developing your gardening knowledge, because you have to think differently sometimes with the way the sun moves over the orientation of the bed. So go for it. Wasabi Gal: judging by the way my chickens love the pathways, I can bet there are lots of cool microbes and bugs there. There you go. The chickens have spoken. So let them speak and help play a role in your planning. And so I'll be doing more discussion, of course, in the months ahead, because I think winter is really a good time for planning. And even those of you that are in Australia starting your season at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's also a good time to start thinking about your planning this early springtime, because we're not active in our garden. It's when we're active in our garden that sometimes we overlook things that we should have been thinking about. And so the seeds, this, I told you, as I have been planting seeds, I have my box with just the packets of seeds that I planted this year. Well, this ties in with the garden journal that we were talking about last week. You've hopefully made notes of what worked, what didn't work, when seeds did best, when you sowed the seeds, all those factors that play into your garden journal that now become part of your planning. And so take the actual seed packet and make it part of your plan in conjunction with what you've learned about that plant that you grew this year. And now as we move forward and we're really going to be starting to focus more on developing our garden plan, well, you have the actual seed packet or the actual seeds that you saved and the information from your garden journal. And so by the time planting time comes, hopefully all the work is already done. And then it's just a simple matter of taking those seeds and laying them out in rows or laying them out in blocks or starting them indoors first and then transplanting. That's the easy part. And I think too many gardeners stress over that part of gardening way more than they need to, because you can already do it now in a less stressful situation because you got time. And then when the actual time comes, it's a piece of cake. You've got the seed packet, you've got it planned out, you know where you're going to put it because you've already figured it out months ahead of time. And my seed sowing time is a matter of minutes because there's no thinking involved. It's just taking the seeds and putting them in the ground in the place that I'd already figured out where they're going to go. For me, planting is one of the easiest activities that I do. I love doing it because it's so easy and because I know what the results should be. And so it's the planning, like right now, that actually helps make all that happen. Yankee Sister, always nice to see you. We missed you when you weren't here, so it's nice to see you when you are here, enjoying beautiful foliage in the yard. Wonderful live. Gardner Scott, thank you. It's because of all of you, of course, that help make it wonderful. So glad to be here once again. Take care and blessings. And blessings back at you. Yeah, it was noticeable when you weren't here, so I'm glad you're back. Okay, let's see what else we can look at. Joe Price, if you clip a fully grown flower, for example, marigold or calendula, are the seeds viable to let dry and store, or do you need to let the plant completely die? No, you don't need to let the plant die. In fact, as soon as that flower has dried and those seeds are brown on the plant, you can start collecting those seeds and the plant can continue to grow. So depending on the time of year and depending on the plant, you can do this throughout the season. And by cutting off those spent flowers with the dried seeds, you might actually encourage new growth. Now, for many of us at this time of year for the marigold and the calendula, there isn't going to be a lot of time for new flowers to develop. But there's still flowers on the plant, and there's young flowers along with the old flowers. Clip off those old dried flowers and make room for those young flowers to bloom, and the plant's going to look better. It's not going to look ragged at all. So, the dried seeds on the flowers should be viable. And as soon as they reach that point, cut them off, bring them indoors, and start going into that mode of labeling and storing until next year when you're going to grow them. Or, like I like to do, and I did it with my calendula last year, and I'll do it again this year. It's on my list of activities to do shortly, is sprinkle them in the same area. If you want to grow more of those plants in the same garden bed, go ahead and, as you're saving some seeds for the future gardens and maybe other beds, that's another great reason to save seeds, is to expand those plants into other areas of your garden. But go ahead and take some of those dried flower heads and sprinkle those seeds now. And they'll get the vernalization, they'll get that cold stratification they need, and they'll sprout whenever it's time, whenever the soil's warm enough and the moisture's right and the sun is right. And that's an easy way to spread flowers throughout your garden. And then the ones you've saved, you can start those ahead of time indoors and grow as plants. And that's what I'm doing this year. So last year I spread flower seeds at this time of year everywhere. But I also took some of those seeds and grew plants. And then as the seeds started sprouting in spring, wherever I saw a bare spot, that's where I would put the plant from the same seeds that I had saved. And so that's how you fill in a space with flowers, especially if you want a native flower garden and those pollinator gardens where they're just filled with flowers. That's how I do it. Spread the seeds and then also save the seeds to grow the plants to fill in the empty spaces. And that actually ends up working pretty well. Tony says, one tip is to do a viability test before storing seeds. You'll not waste time in spring that way. Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was talking about earlier when Frank was asking about doing a viability test. Now, most of us can find an extra closet to store seeds that we'll forget about. And so that's why it helps to do the viability test, to only save the seeds that you know are going to be viable, especially if it's an old packet of seed and you're not sure if it's worth saving because you don't have a lot of space in your photo album to put your seeds. Yeah, do a viability test, and that'll help you decide whether you want to save them or should save them going into the next season. And so as we're talking about all of this, I have a question for you all. And because of a garden that hits 25 degrees Fahrenheit, -4 Celsius, it's real easy for me to say my garden is done. I'm done for the year. I clean them up. They're ready for next year, and then move on to something else. So the question is, are you a year-round gardener? Or do you only garden when the plants are actively growing? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I think it makes a difference in the long run of how successful you will be as a gardener. I talked about having my shelf of gardening books within my reach to include Tony's book on composting. That's because now is the time of year that I think gardeners really have the opportunity to become better gardeners. Because all that time that you were going out to the garden and watering, or going out to the garden and pruning or mulching or collecting the fruit, doing the harvest, you already had that time built into your day. That was already part of your scheduled activity. Take that time. Why not use that time during the winter as an educational opportunity to complete filling in the pages of your garden journal, to do things that other people, those that just dabble with gardening, don't do. And I see this, and Eli and Tony and Robin will all be able to say the same thing. Our videos on our gardening channels have fewer views in the winter. During the growing season, people are watching videos on how to grow tomatoes, how to prune tomatoes, how to make pepper sauce, how to do all these things. When we're actively gardening, we're looking up videos on how to garden. But how many of you are watching videos in November and December and January? Those of us that are in winter, or for winter, wherever it happens to be that you're watching from. Are you continuing to watch those videos? I suggest on your coldest, snowiest day of winter, you should be watching a video on how to grow tomatoes. You shouldn't wait until the tomatoes are in the ground to watch a video on how to grow tomatoes. You should have watched that video months before you ever even got the seed for that tomato. And that's how I've been able to select some varieties over the course of the year. Is I'll watch a video or read a book or look at a blog that talks about growing tomatoes and recommends a particular variety. Well, when I'm doing that in December, I have plenty of time to buy those seeds, to start the plant, to fully develop and finish my garden plan, and then grow that in the garden the next year. If I wait until it's time to put plants in the ground to decide what tomato plants I'm going to grow, it's going to greatly reduce my options. I'm going to have to just go to the store and buy whatever it is they're selling. And that may not match with the way I want to garden. So be a year-round gardener. You don't have to be in your garden actively gardening to be gardening. Planning is an important aspect of it. Analyzing what happened is an important aspect. Learning more about it is an important aspect. So keep watching videos, all of our channels and more. Keep learning, keep becoming the gardener that you are meant to be, even during those times when you're not really thinking about gardening. And so I have part of my schedule every day throughout the year. I watch a gardening video or 7. And of course, during the active growing season, I'm watching videos on pests and things that might be affecting my plant at that time. That's what a lot of us do. But the rest of the year, I'm catching up on the channels I like to watch. I'm discovering new channels that I never knew existed. And I'm learning how to grow plants that I've never grown before, but now become part of my garden for the future. So be a year-round gardener. Don't give up now just because your garden may be fading. Use this as an opportunity to take that same amount of time and put it all into your development so that next year gardening is way easy because you've spent all this time learning and preparing and planning and becoming to the kind of gardener that you know what you're doing without that struggle. And yeah, you may still have questions, and there's still lots of information to know, but you know your sources and you know where to go to get the information because you've spent so much time figuring out your most reliable sources. So I'm a year-round gardener, and I've been a year-round gardener for years, which is one reason why I can sit here and tell you about gardening, because I don't give up gardening just because it gets too cold outside. I actually get out there and do more. But it's in my head, it's in my chair, it's in front of my computer, but I'm still actively gardening and getting all those same wonderful brain drugs working through to make me happy because I can't be out there touching my plants. Be a year-round gardener, and I think you'll like it. So let's do this again next Monday. Let's talk about something else that's gardening related, and I hope to see you all back as we share information and our questions and our answers from all over the world. I do want to say that in 2 weeks, the time of this live stream is going to be different because here in the United States, we practice this notion of daylight savings time. And so in 2 weeks, daylight savings time ends, which means that whatever time you're watching this video right now, well, it's going to happen 1 hour earlier. And so if you're watching at 3 o'clock in Australia, it's actually going to be 2 o'clock in Australia. Or if you're watching at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the UK, it's actually going to be at 3 o'clock in the UK. For the rest of us that practice daylight savings time, it'll be the same time on the clock, unless you're in a place like Arizona that doesn't do daylight savings time. I know it gets crazy when we start changing our clocks, but I'll remind you again next week. Just be aware that it's going to be an hour earlier for me as far as the sun is concerned, but it's going to be the same time on the clock. regardless, we'll try to get you here at the right time and talk gardening in 2 weeks. Next week, normal time, normal place, and I'll see you there. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.